Everybody, welcome to the Monday, April 20th lecture of American Legislative Process. I hope that you are all doing well and are staying safe and healthy. I'm recording this video on Sunday afternoon, sitting in my backyard in Dallas, and my kids are out here playing, so if you hear some noise in the background, then that's probably what it is. Alternatively, there's also a very vocal mockingbird who is in the red oak tree that is in my backyard, and he just started chirping like a minute ago. So perfect timing as far as that goes, but he may be something else that you hear. But anyway, we will work through it. And again, I hope that you are all doing really well, and sorry that the annotated bibliographies are not yet completely graded. I've gotten to almost half of them. I'm hoping to work on them some more tonight and then again tomorrow. And just so you've got enough time to make sure that everything's squared away before the final paper is due. All right, so I want to spend a few minutes reviewing what we talked about last week, which was Congress's interaction with the courts in American politics. And this week we'll continue the theme of discussing Congress kind of vis-a-vis the other branches of government. So we've now done the presidency, we've done the courts, and this is going to be a little bit different because this week we'll be talking about Congress and the bureaucracy, which is of course not its own branch of government. It's housed nominally, at least, in the executive branch. So, but it is a really important part of the lawmaking process, and one that is, in my opinion at least, really understudied. So we'll get to that in a minute. But first, I wanted to briefly review our discussion of Congress and the courts, which took place in this framework of adversarial legalism. And this term adversarial legalism is something that comes up a lot in some of my other classes. Law, politics, and public policy in particular is sort of built around this idea. But the point of it is that it's a way of looking at the American court system in a comparative perspective, meaning how can we compare our courts to courts elsewhere in other similar Western industrialized nations, and then what can that comparison tell us about what our courts are good at, what they're not good at, how they're unique, how they sort of have things that are universally in common with other court systems and other democracies. And so essentially what we've come to realize is that American courts are far more involved in the policy-making process than courts in other nations. And what this has to do with our course is that in other countries, it is usually, almost always, the legislative body that assumes the vast majority of the policy-making load in any given country. And this is sort of true in the US, but also because we know that Congress is gridlocked, we know that Congress is highly polarized, and for other reasons, they, just sort of our political culture, they sometimes tend to outsource the policy-making duties to the courts. And so I think it's really interesting if we're thinking about lawmaking in general in the US, it's not just a story about what Congress does, right? It's a story about what the courts do as well. And so that was the framework for talking through the case study, which we talked about last week, which was the FAIR Act, which was the piece of legislation that Congress considered passing during President Bush's second term to replace the asbestos litigation sort of compensation policy regime with something that was much more bureaucratic and was going to be a program run through the United States Department of Labor. And that act failed for a bunch of reasons that we talked about last week, but I think broadly it's indicative of what federal policymaking looks like in Congress these days. This was an act to replace a policy sort of regime that was very unpopular and did not work for everybody that was involved with it, save for one group, which was the trial attorneys. And yet, even then, Congress was unable to really get its act together and enter the policymaking game. And so what I hope you'll take away from this is that when the U.S. um, when the United States Congress kind of abdicates its policymaking responsibility, it's not that it's not that policymaking just disappears. It's that other branches of government step into the void. Also, my neighbor just started using a saw on something, so also perfect timing. But anyways, we'll get through it. Um, all right, for this week, we're going to be talking about the courts and the bureaucracy. So, what is the bureaucracy? What does it mean? How has it grown over time? What are agencies? And what is the federal rulemaking process? And how does that interact with what Congress does or does not do? And for next time, I want you to read the article by Haley Sweetland Edwards called He Who Makes the Rules, which in my mind is pound for pound one of the most valuable and instructive magazine articles for learning about Congress and learning about policymaking that I have ever read. It's phenomenal. And I know this time of year, always you're trying to triage and determine what readings you have time to do, and that's probably even more so the case this semester. But if you're at all interested in this stuff beyond just trying to get a good grade in this class, I would highly recommend reading this article. I think that you'll find it worth your time. All right, so as if the legislative process was not hard enough, right? As if it was not hard enough for Congress to actually get its act together and pass a bill. Once bills are signed into law, the process of policymaking has really only just started, and the battle over what the bill means has just started. And it's kind of amazing, really, to think about because we know that laws and bills have to run this, grueling gauntlet of potential veto points. Whether it's the threat of the filibuster, whether it's making it on the agenda in the first place, whatever it is, it's very, very, very difficult to get a bill passed in Congress, even under the best of times. And so, what we're going to be talking about here today is what happens after the bill is passed and it's got to go through the agencies in order for the statutory law, the statutory language rather that's in the bill to be translated then into rules for people to follow. So this week then is about what happens after Congress, the president, and sometimes the courts do their job to successfully create policy. So our motivating question is this: after a bill is passed by Congress and then signed into law by the president, what happens? Well, the answer is that administrative agencies of the federal government are charged with writing the rules that then enforce the bill. And the interplay between Congress and agencies, as I've already mentioned, is a super important part of trying to figure out not only how policymaking works, but really how the American government, the federal government in particular, works. And it's not only important, it's enormously understudied, in my opinion. So the president and Congress both share some influence over the executive branch of the government. Um, Congress is constitutionally authorized, of course, to both organize and subsequently fund the executive branch. And the Senate, under their requirement of providing advice and consent, they confirm high-level federal appointments by the executive branch, which is a power that stems from the second article of the Constitution, and in particular, Section 2. And as the senator has said, I forget which one, but the real purpose of vetting is to understand the person's ability to perform the job and to be confirmed for the position. We also want to avoid surprises. This, by the way, is kind of fundamentally under attack, as President Trump has shown his strategy of filling high-level agency positions with what he calls acting heads, which do not require Senate confirmation, and as a result, the Senate is unable to do its duty of advising and consenting, even if they have a Republican majority, and these people would probably be confirmed anyway. So Congress tends to wield authority in three different ways over the bureaucracy and the federal personnel system, and this authority stems from the Constitution, it stems from statutory language and precedent, and also informal kind of norms-based authority. The civil service in the United States, which is broadly kind of what we tend to think of as the federal government, unelected officials, was created after somebody who had tried to get a job and failed assassinated James Garfield in 1881. And before then, the civil service was dominated by the patronage system. It actually wasn't even what we would consider a civil service. It was a series of sort of who you know encounters where elected officials would fill postmaster positions, they'd fill customs positions, etc. And what this was meant to do was to provide some kind of order to the system and provide merit as the key rationale for not only hiring people, but then also promoting people. So it was about how well you did your job rather than simply who you know. And career civil servants are governed today by the Hatch Act, which means that they cannot run for political office, nor could they use their authority to exert influence over an election or wear political buttons that endorse a particular candidate while on duty. And not only that, but high government officials are also subject to a cooling off period after leaving government service. So a bureaucracy, this is not in the U.S., but not just in the U.S. rather, but it's sort of a broad definition, is a body of non-elected government officials and or an administrative policy-making group. And bureaucracies, despite their reputation, are in fact the most efficient and rational way in which human activity can be organized. This is according to the sociologist Max Weber. Yet bureaucracies have also taken on clearly negative political connotations. They're often seen as a labyrinth, they're seen as an endless morass of red tape, and they're seen as some kind of Kafkaesque dehumanizing agent. So the downsides of bureaucracy are that bureaucratic action can often be very, very slow. And this is true in the best of circumstances. It's also true, of course, in times like today, where companies are trying to apply, for example, for small business administration loans. They're unable to do so in a timely way, and then the fund that was put in place in the CARES Act a few weeks ago runs out of money. Or, as some of you may have found out, applying, for example, for unemployment benefits through the state of Texas can also be a tediously slow process that kind of hesitates to work well under the best of conditions and right now is really struggling. So, for example, the National Advisory Committee on Occupational Safety and Health notes that it takes OSHA, so that's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they're the ones who govern, for example, like workplace safety rules. It takes them an average of 10 years to develop and promulgate a health or safety standard. 10 years. That's a really, really, really long time. And it makes it, in many ways, very difficult for OSHA to stay on top of technological or workplace changes, meaning that regulators have tended to move more slowly than the marketplace does. And examples of this are everywhere, right? So the government, for example, trying to get their hands around the trading of mortgage-backed securities and the collapse of that market that led to the 2008 Great Recession, trying to regulate ride-sharing programs in different cities all across not only the country but the world. Dallas's experience with the flood of bike share programs from a few years ago that ended with tangles of bikes found all over the city, from Deep Ellum to White Rock Lake to downtown, and also, of course, the response to the coronavirus, right? So you had, for example, the Center for Disease Control relying on their own regulations and refusing to allow private labs to develop and implement a test to test whether or not people have coronavirus. They refused to allow private labs to do this in the early days of the pandemic, and as a result, when their test was sort of malfunctioning because of reasons that were their own fault, they hadn't allowed private companies to enter the marketplace, and so as a result, the U.S. suffered from extreme lack of the bureaucracy fits in into the government writ large. So the size of the federal government has been a hugely contentious issue in American politics ever since the founding. Of course, Thomas Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists were arrayed against Hamilton and Madison and Jay as the Federalists, arguing over the size and scope and sort of power and dispatch that the federal government would possess. And the national government's role, any way you slice it, has greatly expanded since the turn of the 20th century. There have been periods of government growth. Obviously, during the Great Depression, the federal government grew. During World War II, the federal government grew. Post-war, the government grew. Also been signs and periods of contraction as well. We're living in one at the moment. Also during periods of retrenchment, during the Reagan administration, that's another example of government shrinking. But by and large, the government has been, if not on a linear upward path, at least a path that is upward. So the World War I is another example. The Great Society, obviously expanding the scope of intelligence services and security apparatus in the U.S. after 9/11 are other examples. So the federal government spent $4.45 trillion in fiscal year 2019 and ran a deficit of $1.1 trillion. And this is up from $500 billion, which was what the deficit was in 2016. The true size of government, when you include not only government employees but also contractors, is about 15 million employees, 4.1 million civilian employees, military and postal workers, and then 10.5 million contractors who are not directly employed by the government but are contracted by the government. So this period of government expansion during the New Deal is really influential and has stayed with us in many ways. There was a flood of New Deal legislation, obviously, that took place in the 1930s, and as a result, the size of the federal government was greatly expanded. So these are just a few of the government expanding pieces of legislation that were passed during the New Deal. There's the Federal Register Act, which required the rules to be published and then disseminated to the public. That added to the capacity of the federal government as well. There was the National Environmental Policy Act that happened later in the 1960s. This requires construction projects to produce an impact statement to ensure that agencies consider certain issues, often environmental issues, during the rulemaking process. And then also there was the Paperwork Reduction Act, which was meant to reduce the burden on individuals and small businesses when the federal government wants to collect information from them. And you'll notice that I skipped over the Administrative Procedure Act, and I'm saving the most important for last because it was designed to bring regularity and predictability to the decision-making process that led to the creation of rules. And it provides for both informal and formal rulemaking. And I'll talk a little bit more about it right now. So it became law in 1946 in direct response to New Deal expansion of the bureaucracy. It governs the rulemaking process, and it effectively guides every single stage of the rulemaking process, including a team of rulemakers. And these rulemakers include researchers, analysts, economists, and lawyers. And Congress often makes statutes that they pass intentionally vague, hoping to defer to rulemakers' technical expertise. Remember, as a lawmaker, you're representing not only your district, but the entire nation in some way, and you're dealing with issues that are extremely diverse, and so it's very difficult to have the level of expertise needed to write detailed laws in every single issue. So most interpretation of statutes at the agency level comes during the period of notice of proposed rulemaking, also shortened to be the NPRM. And this is where the agency that's in question, whether it's the Department of Labor or whatever, eventually publishes a proposed rule. The public then gets adequate time to comment. That's usually 60 days. And then agencies send their rules to the White House Office of Management and Budget, which reviews costs and benefits, and eventually the agency publishes a final rule. And this process is outlined much more clearly and with more detail than I'm going to do here in the Edwards article called He Who Makes the Rules. The federal rulemaking process is a misunderstood and understudied component of the policymaking process. By statute, can you please stop doing that for a second? Okay, can you stop with the mower? Thank you. By statute, Congress delegates to federal entities the task of implementing rules and regulations. We'll talk much more about this on Wednesday. Make sure to read the article. But for now, there are three ways that a law can change after passage. The first is that a law can be challenged in the federal court system. The second is that Congress can sort of retroactively gut its own laws after passing them, or they can also bleed them a slow death with loopholes and lack of appropriation. This has happened a little bit with respect to Obamacare during the years of the Trump administration. They can also obviously pass bills but then not fund them. But then the third is agencies, which is the one that we're concerned about this week. And agencies, as I mentioned, are heavily involved in the drafting of rules as well as their interpretation. And lobbyists and bureaucrats are really, really involved in this process. So if you think about the policymaking process, you can think about Congress and the presidency sharing these formal policymaking powers. And then everything that they do gets filtered through agencies before they become law. And I like this quote: "The crucial intermediate process of rulemaking stands between the enactment of law by Congress and the realization of the goals that both Congress and the people it represents seeks to achieve by that law." So in other words, there is literally nothing. It is impossible, really, for a bill that Congress passes to have any meaning in the populations that it's meant to serve or meant to regulate or whomever until it first passes through the rulemaking process. So as far as agencies go, a regulatory agency is a public authority or government agency that is responsible for exercising autonomous authority over some area of human activity in a regulatory or supervisory capacity. So part of the executive branch, for example, and headed by a cabinet secretary. So the example here would be the Environmental Administration. An independent regulatory agency, on the other hand, is a regulatory agency that is mostly free from executive oversight. Examples here are the CIA, the Federal Trading Commission, etc. Regulatory agencies deal mostly in the area of administrative law, in regulation or rulemaking. And they're usually a part of the executive branch of the government with statutory authority to perform their functions with oversight from the legislative branch. And they're also, of course, open to legal review from the judicial branch. And other examples here include the Environmental Protection Agency, Federal Communications Commission, etc. And you do not need to memorize this chart by any means, but this sort of gives you a sense of how complicated the rulemaking process is and what part of this process, this article, He Who Makes the Rules, will cover and what we'll talk about on Wednesday. So it is this period between the publication of the notice of proposed rulemaking and then when that final rule is kind of signed off on within the agency and within the department. And the He Who Makes the Rules article is really interesting, in large part because I just think it does a great job of explaining this process, but it's also about the Dodd-Frank regulatory bill meant to regulate the financial industry and America's commercial and investing banking institutions after the Great Recession. And I think that in many ways we are living in a world right now that demonstrates quite clearly that Dodd-Frank did not do what it set out to do. But what Edwards' article does is explains sort of the genesis of why that might be the case. So I think that you'll find it very interesting. Also, I would encourage you, if you've made it this far but have not yet watched the video that I posted the other day about the final paper, please go and watch it. I think I posted it on Thursday, April 16th. And please don't hesitate to let me know if you have any questions. I may talk a little bit more about the final paper during Wednesday's lecture. So that's all for me today. I hope, again, that you're all happy and healthy and safe, and I will check back in on Wednesday. Thanks so much.